we talk about the operating budget, but we'll be glad to talk. We've got a little bit about the capital, but we'll be glad to talk about anything else. Ancillary sometimes is a question and things. We've prepared a budget plan. The budget plan and all of these documents are on the website now. I think they're all up. I didn't check myself, but they're all up. The budget plan itself speaks to the 5 different budgets at the university, so research, fundraising, capital, ancillary, and the operating. Most of our discussion today will talk about the operating budget. So, first of all, another balanced budget, 23rd successive year. Again, this is balanced from the operating budget perspective. Some people, just in case there's a question, some people have wondered, can the university run a deficit? Yes, we could. That's a board prerogative and board decision. Did we think about it? Yes, we did. But looking forward and things, we realized that would be not a very good move. Next year might be equally as difficult. That's all of the forecasting from the province and things like that seems to indicate something like that. So this budget does not have a deficit. It's balanced, but we did think about it. It's still recognizing that one of our biggest challenges is the fact that we have very little discretionary money. 74% of the budget is salaries and benefits. People for the number of years now have been saying don't do across-the-board cuts equal to all units, but rather make some hard decisions and make those allocations differential across each of the different units. And that's exactly what this budget does. You'll see the details anywhere from investing in some faculties or in one faculty. That's about how little it is. And then cuts in others. I'd also mention at this time that even though we speak in terms of cuts and things, this is the first year that in real terms, from an envelope funding perspective, that we've actually reduced many, many units. So even this year, not all units actually are getting a reduction in the operating budget. But for a number of years now, the purchasing power has dropped. And so that's why we sort of talk in terms of cuts. There's a small amount of reinvestments. In fact, we've got a slide we'll tell you where each one of these things is. And in fact, the publishing of the budget letter that's on the web will have it in detail. Every penny that has changed from last year's budget to this year's budget is identified in that budget plan, and so you can look at it. I've got some extra copies of some hard copy versions of it if you wanted to grab one on the way out, but they're on the web. We had those because we had meetings with our leadership team yesterday, the unions, and with CCB, and we've made copies for them there. Tuition fees, and we'll have a slide on that as well, increasing by 2.5%. And we've also taken a bit of a risk, and we're projecting in this budget that next year our enrollments are going to increase by 1%. And so we've already pre-spent that money in terms of allocations to the units. If it doesn't come, then that'll make it even more difficult when end the year with a little bit of a deficit, but it helps reduce the amount of the cuts that we would have otherwise. A couple other different things in terms of what we got from the province. Now you're going to hear a number of different numbers here with respect to the province, and I'll maybe try and walk through them quickly for you. From an accounting perspective, and in the budget plan, we need to take and identify all of the net changes from the provincial grant. So here's a number of them that factor into that. And if you factor them all in together, it means it's a 4% decrease or $4.6 million. But you would have heard from the budget speech and a number of other different places that we actually got a 5% cut to our operating budget. We also got reduced by the amount of it's not up on that slide, but almost $500,000 in scholarship money. $327,000 for Johnson Shammer, $100,000 cut in Mackenzie Art Gallery, which is flow through to us. It doesn't fall to our bottom line, but it's part of our budget allocation. We also, in the budget, are experiencing the impacts of PST change, which is estimated about $500,000, plus 3.5% of all future capital construction projects. If you add all of those up, plus those, and those would be base budget changes. Last year, you may recall as well, we had $1.6 million one-time clawback. That's the second year in a row. You add up all those things, it's actually a net reduction of 7%, over $7 million. But one of the good news pieces that came over this past year, and that's from the good work that we have done. We don't attribute it to a budget decision from the government, but from increasing activity in mainly student enrollment numbers, but also some research activity. We, in the funding formula shift, got an extra $1.25 million at the expense of U of S. So that came our way, and it was a reduction for them. When you wrap all of that together, it ends up being that 4% number. So overall, that means our revenues, because as I mentioned, we'll talk about tuition. Tuition has gone up, enrollments we're projecting going up, so those are increased revenues. You subtract that from the reduction in the government grant revenue, and we're actually down by 1.1, but we then still have to take and honor all of the collective agreements, so the progression through the ranks, the merit, the increments, depending on which collective agreement are, go up by about $2 million, and so we've got an overall increase of more than $2 million for that. This is our first year that our net operating budget, though, is actually decreasing by $1.3 million. Got a couple of examples there of places where we've had to take in non-discretionary ways, take and invest in money. So things like space rental, in particular up at in Saskatoon, to be able to bring together, which is a fantastic move for everyone I've talked to, bringing nursing and social work together, but it's more space, and there's a cost for that decision. Reductions, one that I'd really like to point to, and thanks for those of you that have suffered through some of the electrical upgrades and things like that, because it's been room by room across the campus, but it's reaping incredible savings. As you can see, just $388,000 gross on this campus this year as a reduction. In fact, the power bill itself is lower this year than it was before we built Kissick. So even though we've got that incredible load, and that's because of the number of energy savings initiatives across, both in that project but across the campus. So it's actually taking pressure off the operating budget and has for years. The last thing that we just do, a bit of an overview and things, highlight the fact that there's only 4 units that are going to be exempt from budget reductions at all. And in fact, Tom will go through a slide showing you every faculty and every unit what the impact was. But those are the 4, and those 4 were chosen based on significant input in a variety of different ways. Of course, what the faculties and AVPs and things like that presented as arguments, discussions at a variety of forums, but in particular, good, hard-working input from the Council Committee on Budget as well. So Faculty of Engineering, Grad Studies, Indigenization, and International. Also like to highlight a group again. I think we've done this every year, the Yeoman Service of the People in the Centre for Continuing Education. Their budget right now is about $29 million, and out of that $29 million, they now generate a net revenue, so a profit that comes back to the center that then goes out to all of the units of $10.9 million. For most of the past number of years, at least the past 4 or 5 years, the growth in the profit from CCE has been larger than the grant increase, or even better now when it decreases, than the grant increase even in the good years that we got from the government. So the work that we're doing internally, particularly our colleagues up at Centre for Continuing Education, is making a real difference in terms of taking and softening the blow across the campus. It's now a profit up to $10.9 million, and this is that's what we're predicting. They were a little bit less than that this year, but we've challenged them to produce even more next year, despite the fact that they're in temporary accommodations. So absolutely fantastic work for them, and thanks to them. Otherwise, this budget making would be even that much more difficult.
So just before we get to that, too, a note for CCE, in case you're not familiar with the operations there, it's things like the conservatory, the senior center, lifelong learning, ESL, the off-peak teaching, the distance learning, all of those sort of ancillary operations, both credit and non-credit, are now an absolutely fundamental part of our business. When we last spoke with you at the town hall on the 31st of March, we had just absorbed the news from the provincial government that Dave has outlined with the cuts. We were still trying to digest at that point the actual meaning of the PST changes, and we think, as Dave said, again, we've got a fairly good grasp of what that's going to mean for us. But it has meant a very substantial cut to the operating funds of the university. I'm not going to go through this line by line, but I want to just give you a few highlights so that you understand how this table works. It's linked to tables in the budget letter, which is now up on the webpage, and I would invite you to go through that in any amount of detail that you would like. And if you have questions about that, please send them to the address we'll have at the end of the slide presentation. We'll be happy to answer those questions. And indeed, today, if we have a bit of time during this presentation, we may just go to the budget letter to show you a more detailed version of this table. What the table shows by faculty, the 9 faculties, is how much tuition is earned in the faculty, what the baseline budget for the coming year is projected to be, what the headcount enrollment in that faculty has been. First column is over 5 years, and the second column is year to year into the present year, into 16 and 17. And then what we're putting per student, per full load equivalent student into each of those faculties. Full load equivalent student is simply a measure of teaching, basically, how many students you've got in that faculty and how much you are teaching them. As you see, there's a pretty wide variation. A lot of them are clustered around the $6,000, $7,000 mark, but we do have a couple of outliers, reflecting the fact that some disciplines are inherently more expensive to teach than others. You can, to take 2 examples from either end of the spectrum, you can teach a discipline like economics relatively inexpensively because you don't need expensive labs. You can teach fairly large sections successfully. It works pedagogically. You don't have a lot of specialized equipment and so on. Whereas if you move over, say, to media, art, and production, if you're training a music student or if you're training a pottery student or if you're training someone in one of the performing arts, you typically have smaller classes, particularly in years 3 and 4. You have a lot of space devoted to things like music studios, kilns, pottery studios, and so on and so forth. And it's just more expensive, by definition, to teach those students. But this chart gives you an idea of what the spread is on campus. Now, that's not the only decision-making point, but obviously we look at that table and we say, there's a problem in that table. If you look at engineering, engineering is the, well, if we just hold that one for a second, engineering is $4,705 a student. At the other end of the scale, $14,800 a student. What that reflects in engineering, and our colleagues of engineering, and you heard this from one of them at the last budget forum, very large classes, even in the 3rd and 4th year level, inadequate access to laboratories, laboratory equipment, tremendous pressure on the faculty and staff of that faculty to cope with a load of teaching that has grown by 50% essentially in the last 5 years. The difficulty is that it's very difficult to address that quickly without net new operating funds. Shifting operating funds within the institution at a time when they're static or now in decline is a very difficult thing to do because you have to wait for vacancies to arise and then move those vacancies. So if we go to the next slide, that's it in graphic format. Engineering is the blue line at the bottom. So you see back in 09-10, they peaked at about 25% below the median funding per student in the university. Then they went way down. We started to pull them back up. We intend to continue to pull them back up so they get a little bit closer to the mean. And this graph, by the way, excludes MAP and nursing, which would be right off the top of the scale. You've seen the numbers in the previous slide. And again, I want to make clear, that's not a criticism of MAP or nursing. It's a reflection of the fact that some programs are inherently way more expensive to teach than others. We move to the next one. So here's what the cuts will be. This is now as approved by the board last week. Just before we start going through those, I wanted to mention to you the 2.5% tuition increase that the board approved will bring us, obviously, much needed additional revenue. We're very sensitive to what tuition means for students, particularly students who are working up to 30 hours a week to pay the bills. We're also conscious of the fact that we need to remain competitive with neighboring universities because we are competing more and more for students outside the Regina area. The Saskatchewan Advantage Scholarship of the last couple of years has offset every tuition increase by more than that increase for Saskatchewan high school graduates, but it's not available to non-Saskatchewan students, nor is it available, obviously, to international students. And international undergraduates pay 3 times the domestic rate. So that's just, again, a little bit of context. So as you see, the cuts range from about a -5 rather, in a faculty like arts, to if we drop down to engineering, we're actually not cutting engineering at all. As you'll see in a moment, we are going to invest 2 new faculty positions in engineering. Those are 2 of only 3 new faculty positions across the entire operation. There's a 4th in Johnson-Shayama. It's an existing faculty position that's a term that is being converted to tenure track, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So you see again, indigenization, as we mentioned earlier, gets no cut. It's a small operation, but indigenization is one of the key strategic themes of the university. We want to continue that thrust. We need to be responsive to the changing student body and responsive to the need to indigenize our curricula. Some faculties are way ahead on that. Others continue to need the assistance and the prompting and the help of an indigenization operation. Library operating. The library has been very stressed, as you know, so it's getting a cut, which means people, but also, or positions, I should say. But we've tried as a gesture to put a little bit into acquisitions this year after keeping acquisitions steady for years. And the thing you have to remember about acquisitions is that most of it is priced in American dollars. So when the exchange rate is unfavorable, as it is, it's costing us more and more. The kind of predatory pricing we're seeing from providers of electronic journals like Elsevier and Wiley and so on and so forth has hurt us quite badly, but it's a problem that all Canadian university libraries are facing. So as a gesture, a little bit into library acquisitions. If we move on. And there you see the rest. Student affairs at -3, UR International, as we mentioned, is 0, the university secretary -4, and the VPR research operation -4, for a total cut of $4.36 million. If we move on to investments.
Tom, let me do the good news part on investments. So there's not many, but they're significant, of course, and with some of the variety of input and things like that we heard. Council Committee on Budget was a big part of that. Lecture in economics was identified. CCE, even though it's all part of the cost recovery system and things, we still identified there was a request and said, yes, UR courses is vital across the campus. That is something that we wanted to take and invest in. Engineering, Tom has spoken to already. Of course, in the base budget and things, all the numbers in there, I think, explain quite well the need for investment there. In fact, the investment probably should be, we'd recognize, probably should be an awful lot deeper, but just not the money there right now. External relations, the continuation of some term positions. And again, as we know, money that we raise is more than levered at least 8 times for any money we get. So this is really an investment to take and get more money. And of course, advertising, the same sort of thing. Facilities management, 2 different items that were identified as well as being good investments. A life system safety manager to coordinate all of the new electronics and technical aspects of keeping the buildings operating and not. The fan system in here would be an example of needing to keep these things working, and the new ones as well. And of course, the continuation till the end of August, the term position as the personal safety coordinator. Johnson-Shama getting approval, but it's being funded by Johnson-Shama for a tenure track position. Library correcting some of the recoveries, and of course then the scholarships, backfilling. When we got notification from the government that that program had been cut, we had already let all the students that are getting this scholarship know, so it's an expense that we had to take and backfill anyway. So $476,000 there, and a couple things in research, the Fedoric Chair support, which is a how many year? 5-year commitment that we're funding again, and a new initiative to create a data center support, a tiny contribution from the university to lever a whole bunch of different effort that we will be the main benefactors of from a number of different government ministries and perhaps a private sector partner.
Let me just say a couple of more things. That Fedoric Chair, just so you know what's going on there, because Jesus is here. You remember a couple of years ago we announced the hiring of a new physicist who was funded, whose position was funded by the Fedoric Center for Nuclear Research. in Saskatoon. So the salary and benefits of that position are totally covered for 5 years. And in order to lever that, we committed to $30,000 a year of annual support for that individual's research program. That individual is in place. It's turned out to be a fantastic colleague, and we hope will be with us for many years. But that's what that little detail is, tying into external funding that was in the amount of ZZ's 1.5 million that came into the university. So that's how that thing works. And in the, again, the JSGS, we had an instance, if you remember the graph with all of those curved lines, you saw JSGS just sort of loop like that. And what happened was we introduced a new master's program in health administration. The colleagues in the school made it a tremendous success. It outshot all of its projections. So they said, we have someone who's very good in that program. We want to retain him. We said, I'm sorry, we don't have a permanent position for that person. We negotiated, and what they agreed to do was to cover that line, convert it from term, which is limited, the person would leave at a certain date, to tenure track, so he will be here permanently, with that permanent position funded strictly from the revenues that are being earned by the program in which the individual teaches. So, we've mentioned the $40,000. The regional data center is essentially something that would be of greatest use to the social scientists on campus, though of use to many other faculty members and researchers as well. And as Dave has said, there's a promise of a fair amount of money from various levels of government and even industry to set this thing up on campus, a facility to which many people could have access for purposes of research. So we put in $40,000 in the hope that we will attract that outside money and provide a facility that otherwise on our own we simply could not afford. We continue the provisions annually of $200,000 into the Faculty of Science and the Faculty of Engineering and Applied Science. That was begun about 3 years ago in response to the fact that the equipment in some areas of those faculties was so badly out of date that, as we joked, except it was serious, it still contained the University of Saskatchewan Regina campus label, which is pre-1974. Now, some wags will point out that if a microscope is still working 30 years later, 40 years later, you can still use it. But we do need to upgrade for the sake of training students on contemporary equipment in those faculties, so we've maintained that provision into each of those faculties for another year. You know that there are recruitments underway for a number of Canada Research Chairs are on campus, one in the Faculty of Education, one in the Faculty of Arts, one in Johnson-Shayama, and what am I forgetting? Two in Engineering, of course. And in order to get that federal money, because those chairs come with a lot of federal money, $500,000 for a Tier 2, we need to invest some money here. We felt that it was entirely appropriate to bolster our research strength and to bolster our teaching strength and to bolster further faculty strength in very strained areas, that we put in investments of university money to attract that very large sum of federal money, $500,000 a chair. So that's what that is. We are funding $10,000 to URI to bring in a visiting scholar from Korea. The reason for that is not just the exchange, the scholarly exchange, which is very valuable, but Korea is a market we wish to open up. We wish to have better links with Korea and to bring in qualified Korean students in increasing numbers to the University of Regina. Visiting scholars' positions help cement bridges like that, and eventually, we hope, will help us recruit more students from Korea, and we've mentioned the Fedoric Chair. So, tuition, we've talked about. We don't like to raise tuition. We are glad that the provincial scholarship scheme in recent years has offset more than the tuition increases than we've applied for Saskatchewan high school graduates. But in looking at tuition, and I urge you please to go onto the budget update page and look at the information item on tuition that went to the board as a decision item. And you'll see how carefully argued that is, looking at comparators, looking at levels of student debt, looking at the market, looking at all kinds of things before making this recommendation to the board, which they accepted. But the key message here, and we've said this before, is we're becoming more, not less sensitive to tuition revenues as they become a greater proportion of our operating budget. And we need to keep so carefully in mind that we remain competitive with institutions of similar size and configuration in neighboring areas and not put an unnecessary burden on students. The graduate international surcharge increases by 2.5%. So though undergraduate international students pay 3 times the domestic rate, graduate students pay that fee plus the domestic rate. And the reason for the differential is very simple. The logic behind that is that Saskatchewan families have, through their taxes over many years, contributed to the building of the university and so on, and therefore current students from Saskatchewan or Canadian students pay roughly 38% of the cost of running the university. The international undergraduates are paying much closer to full cost of the education that's being provided to them. Many of you wouldn't know about the seniors tuition waiver. This is a relic of the past when there was a category that actually meant something called seniors. When you became 65, you were a senior and you retired. You don't retire at 65 anymore unless you choose to do so. And that whole category of seniors has become quite unstable. But it used to be that a senior could come in and say, I'm now 65, basically I want to get into such and such a course, and I'll pay a nominal fee to get into the course, but I'm not going to pay any tuition. And we thought, wait a minute, we've got high demand in some areas. We've got very expensive graduate programs in areas like the Levine School. And what happens if somebody who happens to be 67, who's still working and making a good full income, comes in and says, I'd like free tuition. That's what your policy says. So we recommended to the board that that be limited to undergraduate courses with capacity. So seniors are still welcome under that old policy to come in and fill seats that wouldn't otherwise be filled. That benefits the university through the funding mechanism because it's an additional registration, but it doesn't displace our own students, and it doesn't fill up seats in expensive professional programs with people who possibly could afford the full fare, but didn't under the old policy. We've talked about the $476,000 reduction in scholarship funding, which we backfilled through contingency, so those students are made whole into the coming year. And we're trying to discuss how we fill that hole, which we anticipate will remain next year for next year's round of student recruitment. Increased funding for refugees assistance. We are trying to match what the Students' Union is doing there. And athletic scholarships and graduate scholarships, about $234,000. And just a reminder too, among the Canadian comprehensive universities, Regina is either the second or the third top university in the country in the amount of operating money it puts back into student scholarships. I think Memorial remains ahead of us, and perhaps I think Waterloo, has now moved ahead of us. I think we're number 3, but that's pretty good out of all of the Canadian comprehensives in the amount of money we give back to students from operating in scholarships.
The other one, just talking about briefly, first of all, the decision-making around the PMR, Preventive Maintenance and Renewal funding, basically targeted for infrastructure and equipment at the campus. We got exactly the same amount this year as we did last year, and we allocated exactly the same way this year as we did last year. So that's the breakdown. Again, not enough in any particular area, and we've been reflecting on that. When we don't get enough in this category, what it does is just builds up deferred maintenance in other parts of the campus, and we're starting to see some of that deterioration. But in terms of allocation, in small little bits that are important, $3.5 million for the projects in facilities management, a little bit for classrooms and hallway furniture, and then some as well for the basic backbone of $450,000 for IT equipment, basically the hardware, et cetera, that it takes and we all operate all the time. One of the legacy things, the very first one there, is the $980,000 that we're paying for mortgage for deferred maintenance from, I think it's 12 years ago, when we took and borrowed $14 million to do a number of different key projects, in particular life safety upgrades to the Ad Hum building. So that 5.07, exactly the same thing this year as last year. On the major capital side, now this number, other than from an accounting perspective, because it's a cash flow number only, $61 million is the amount that we anticipate spending over the next year, and it could be the last bit of a project that had started earlier or the next bit of a project that is yet to start. We've got more than $30 or $140 million worth of projects on the go right now, but the expenses for this year will be $61 million. We can talk to any one of those, but of course the big ones that you know about, and some of they're happening in your areas, and thank you very much for your cooperation if they are. So things like the College West, a total midlife refit for $38 million, and of course the College Avenue campus, $60 $0.5 million, and of course all of the people who work up there are displaced in temporary accommodation, so thank you for that as well, and a variety of other projects that are ongoing as well. So that's the presentation so far. We wanted to leave lots of time for questions, and if you didn't want to do a question today, but you had a question or you had a comment or something like that, please send us an email. Is that in the next? Yeah, please send us an email there. And if I go back to that one, all of this data, including some additional data that, as Tom mentioned, so the budget letter, the budget plan, the operations forecast, next year's operations forecast, a large brief on tuition and tuition rates are all up on the web, and they're up there now. So if you want any more details, just have a look. Tom has now flipped up one of the pages in the budget letter, which has a significant amount of detail in it as well, and we'll just walk through it to give you an idea of the sense of detail. As I mentioned before, every new dollar and every reduction in dollars from year to year is identified in this budget plan. So you'd be able to track exactly where money has been spent, where it's changed from the previous year.
So we're just putting this up. Believe me, we're not going to go through that in detail, but you can go through that in as much detail as you like. It's up on the web page. If you go to ORP on the main search page, and then go to budget letters on the left-hand side, each of the annual budget letters is there, and this one is now. Just a couple of things I wanted to point to you. And what you see there, of course, is the unit, base budget, the description of investments in blue and cuts in red. So if you look down to Office of Resource Planning, that's about 4 off the bottom. So that's the unit that does a lot of the budget work, a lot of the reporting work, survey work, statistics that go into government, and so on and so forth. The annual budget for that unit is $807,000. They got a 3% budget reduction of $24,216. But if you look over in the second last column, you'll see that there is no estimated budget increase for salaries and benefits in that unit for the coming year. Why? Because the board approved last week, or decreed last week, that there would be a freeze on all out-of-scope salaries for the coming year. And everybody in that unit, because of the nature of the material they handle, is out of scope. So there's nothing in there. But if you go down now almost to the second bottom line, science is at $16.548 million. It's a 2% budget reduction, so they lost $327,000 of money that they could spend of one kind or another, discretionary money, whatever it might be. But the negotiated increases, so the CGIs and the merits in that faculty, the natural progression through the ranks, and the things that we have to honor in the contracts that we have with people working in the Faculty of Science, means that we've got to put an additional $275,842 just to pay CGIs and merits in that faculty. Therefore, the actual cut to the faculty is only $51,000. And as we said earlier, this is the first year where you're actually seeing some real negatives, because though those smaller cuts in earlier years were there, they were often more than offset by natural progression through the ranks and other contractual obligations. So again, all of that stuff is up in the budget letter. If there's anything there that puzzles you, you want to go through, we're more than happy to answer those questions. And we'll take any questions that you have now, do our best to answer them. We'd only ask that when you come down to the mic, again, when people are watching in Saskatoon and off campus, if you could simply identify yourself and identify your unit, it would be helpful. So floor is open. Please give us your questions. Not a one?
Don't rush.
Either we've bored you to death, or it's obviously not the kind of news that we had hoped to present. Many of the people in the room were there that day at Executive Council. The Wednesday afternoon, the budget came down, and we actually got the news during Executive Council about the operating budget cut. I will never forget the surprise and the reaction in that room that day. Since then, since effectively the third week in March, we've been working very closely with the ULT, with the budget group, with resource planning, with financial services, with HR, and with all of the deans and directors to try to figure a way through this. And this is what we have come up with. This is what the board has accepted. We wish it would have been a lot more pluses rather than minuses, but this is the reality that we are living in right now in this province. If there are no questions, we don't want to keep you here longer than necessary. Thank you very much for coming, and please stop and talk to any of us with any questions you may have individually. Thanks for coming. Oh, question. Kevin, your name today.
You don't get away that easy.
Almost.
Almost. Kevin Siebert, Executive Director for IRFA, sorry. Kevin Siebert, Executive Director for IRFA. A number of units have received a nominal cut in their annual budget. The question is, and from perspective of IRFA, is what is the impact to people? I think that's the question that is on people's minds here and or elsewhere, is what does this mean to me?
Let me begin. And first of all, there will be an impact on positions. As we've said, we're trying to do as much of this as possible through vacant positions. Right now, with the deans and directors having got the official numbers yesterday morning, right before your briefing with IRFA and CUPE, they're now working through the implications for their units. We should know those implications by early to mid next week. We hope that the bulk of it will be through vacant position management, though we know that there will be some impact on people. We don't know precisely what, who, but there will be some. It's unavoidable with a cut of this magnitude.
And I'll just add, you would have heard Vianne on the news and things like that as well. And colleagues of ours, they're not part of any collective agreement and things, but our colleagues at the University Club, as people know, the University Club will be closing at the end of June. So there's 13 people in there that are out of a job and things. And so while they're technically not us, it's a totally a separate entity and things, we consider them part of the family. And Vianne mentioned the club and the fact that I think she mentioned the number of 10 in one of her comments and things. There's a whole bunch of part-time people. There's a number in the club that are a little bit more permanent, but the total number affected there was 13. So we know that it's touching people in our family one way or another already. But as Tom mentions, over the next week or so, we'll be looking at it closely, trying to use vacancy management as much as possible.
In saying that, we know that vacancy management is in some ways a very blunt tool because it's unsystematic and unplanned. Simply those who decide at some point to retire or to leave a position, it becomes vacant. That position may be badly needed, but one of the things we have to weigh is it better to delete that position than to take a job away from somebody else, somewhere else in the operation? It's a whole series of difficult decisions. And as David's mentioned, the people in the University Club have got their notices. I just ran into Glenn in the hallway just before this meeting. It's hard. It's really hard. Many of you know Glenn, the manager of that club, or the, manager, beverage manager, whatever it is. He's been here. He's a fixture here for many, many years, and he won't be here after the end of June. It was a tough conversation.
Other questions? Well, thank you very much for that question. Particularly, it is one, I'm glad that you brought it up because that is probably the thing that we think about the most and the most important aspect and the most difficult aspect of creating this budget. And as Tom mentions, the hard work now comes in the units. Like, it's one thing making a central budget like this. It's another thing executing on difficult news at the unit level. And that's what the next step is.
Anything more? Anything more?
Going once. Going twice. Oh, worked.
Thanks. Sorry, I know this probably is a small beans kind of question. Oh, it's Amanda from Social Work. Just wondering, I was a bit confused, and I'm sorry I was late, so that's why I didn't want to ask the question in the first place. But since nobody else is asking questions, what did you mean when you said under HR that the tuition reimbursements are being reduced by 30,000 for APT 29th, or for APT and QP?
Sorry, was that one of the slides?
Yeah, it was up there. Kelly, can you just tell us what that is, that tuition reimbursement issue for employees?
What it does is we look at the utilization every year, and the budget gets adjusted every year. So if it's down, it goes down. If it's up, it's always level at what we're spending. So it's not taking it's just actually.
Oh,
Okay. So for those who couldn't hear that comment off screen,
Can you
or-
put the budget letter up? I think that was probably the chart where it might have appeared.
so for those who couldn't hear Kelly's comment off mic
Yeah.
there, it's adjusted each year according to usage. So it wasn't used as much last year, the last couple of fiscals, and therefore was adjusted downward. But we will honor the obligations, always, the contractual obligations we have to employees. We have to. We have no choice.
There's probably, I'm guessing, 50 to 100 different budget line items like that. Utilities would be one that we happen to profile, and things. Each of the different groups, collective agreement allocations, and a variety of things, including tuition reimbursement and things like that, are right-sized based on expenditures and projected amounts and things. But the application goes back to the general rules of if people want to go to classes, and that's something that we encourage and things. And so it's still there. We're still encouraging it. It's just the usage was down, so we're using that money to take and minimize the cut to some other part at this particular time. It was in the budget letter.
It was in the budget letter? Okay.
Yeah. It's not in the slide, so that's why I was wondering where.
So the obligations will be honored.
Yeah.
What that reflects is usage patterns right now. Yeah.
Good question and good eyes.
Hi, Britt Hall, Biology. I don't know if Chris Summers is here.
I don't see him.
But I just, this is coming kind of secondhand from him, but prior to the end of classes, he got all of his upper level or third year students together and had a full discussion period during class time about how they would like to see the university address this situation. And so this is coming kind of third hand, but what he told me that they said was that they don't want their tuition cut, and I understand that, and we are, I do believe that the board is considering that quite seriously. But one thing that they said is that they're frustrated by the kind of beautification projects that they see happening around campus. I'll point to an example of what happened in the classroom building on the main floor, where there was like changing of flooring, new furniture, new kind of crazy wall covering. It looks very nice, but I just don't know about the message that kind of work sends to our students. And so I noticed that in your budget you have $138K for building maintenance, and obviously that has to happen. But how much of that is cosmetic? And is that something that we can hold off for, the foreseeable future while we have these challenges?
I think we both got some input on that. So great question, and there are a couple of different ways of viewing it. At a time of great fiscal tightness, restraint, should we be doing anything like that? If you remember about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, the North Corridor of the education building was redone. It used to be just a big sort of vast Soviet-style empty hallway, and it was redone with, those things are full most of the time with students working. What we're trying to do is make sure that the students who are living in residence, of whom we now have about 12 or 1,300 with College West out of circulation right now, have common spaces on campus in which they can work together, because we don't want them in the residence rooms all the time by themselves. We do have some space, common space, in the towers, in the residences, but these spaces allow students to work together with other people around them. And we think it's a really important part of socialization and campus life, so we think it is a defensible investment.
That might be a message that you might want to get out there.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Indeed, it is a fine line as well in terms of how much do you spend on this. Of course, that's out of the capital budget, that $138,000, and you're right about that. The allocation for a combination of improving furniture and study areas in classrooms and in the hallways, et cetera, no matter where does that go as a priority. We have had incredible feedback about a number of different spaces, and they're appreciated and things. So yeah, mixed feelings always. It wouldn't help the operating budget though. Like it wouldn't, in this particular case, none of those would impact, say, some of the other cuts with respect to what might turn out into positions or something like that.
Anything else? Oh, here we go, Sean.
Hello, I'm Sean Wiskar. I'm a URSU representative. I just wanted to ask about the scholarships and the one-time fill that you guys are doing. So moving forward, what does that mean for students for next year when they're applying for scholarships? Does that mean that a lot of those are going away, or?
We are going to try our best to fix that hole because we anticipate similar treatment next year. Don't quote us on that because we don't want to encourage government to give us similar treatment next year. But what they've been signaling is they want to get rid of the deficit in 3 years. This is year 1 of 3. And therefore, we are anticipating an equally tough year next year. We want to maintain at least the current level of scholarship funding that we have, if we can possibly do that. So we are right now starting to think through what we'd have to do in order to backfill that again next year, that hole. And it's $476K, it's a big hole.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in a budget, by the way, and I don't have the number at the tip of my tongue, but I think it's in the order of $8 million or so. I don't know if Brian's here, but the total amount, and as Tom already mentioned, we're number 2 in the country in terms of
3 now, 3, after Waterloo and Memorial.
I'll have to check. Maybe I can make a beer out of this. But yeah, so we're way up there, 2nd or 3rd? 3rd. And in terms of how much we give back. And we like being up there. Like that's that's one of the different benchmarks. Some of the benchmarks we don't necessarily get so bothered about, but that's one that we do try and pay attention to.
Perfect. Thank you.
While we're waiting for another question, and since even the word beautification was used and things like that, I have to put a comment out of thanks for, and I see many people in the room here today that were out and joined us this morning in terms of a campus beautification project and things. And so 105 people were out there taking and picking weeds, picking up cigarette butts, laying mulch, doing all kinds of grounds work and things like that just to make our campus that much more beautiful. So again, it's an investment of a non-cash kind and things, but important to take and make the campus. So thank you very much for everyone that came out. That's much appreciated.
Hi, thank you. Carla from the Career Center. And I've just been, of course, looking at your budget. And I find it interesting, or maybe I'm sort of misunderstanding the goals a little bit, because we have some faculties that are our newer faculties, like nursing and MAP, very fantastic, like projects. And yes, they have been priced and valued at a very high cost per student. I was a music student too. I knew my hours one-on-one were of a different value. But I also had a brother in engineering, and I know he paid a heck of a lot for lab time and all that kind of thing. Is the low rate and the not fall here in the budget, the non-reduction in engineering, is that due to the goal of more recruitment? Because I bet you get more recruitment at any faculty if they're always kept at a lower price rate.
Right. Good question. We have differential tuition in 3 faculties, undergraduate faculties. It costs more to be a nursing student, an engineering student, and a business student, in part because of the career outcomes in those disciplines are better. But the reason for the additional investment in the Faculty of Engineering is simply to try to mitigate current strain in the faculty, which has grown by 50% in 5 years. The loads are way too high. We know that. Loads on staff, loads on APT, loads on faculty and researchers. So in putting 2 new additional positions in there, and the Canada Research Chairs, we're trying to mitigate what we feel is insufficient resources for existing demand in that faculty, which is what that squiggly line slide showed.
But is that squiggly line then really representative of actual recruitment numbers? Because yes, you're going to have way better recruitment in the faculty that is low pricing. Is that putting pressure on one faculty over, like, is...
Yeah, that low number doesn't reflect that a student in engineering is paying less. In fact, in the simplest way, all students pay the same amount.
I misunderstood.
Except there's, as Tom mentioned, there's a premium, so that the interpretation of that chart is different. There is a slight premium. I forget what it is. I think it's about 6 or 8% that all nursing, engineering, and business students pay more for it. So they're not clamoring to engineering because it's cheaper. In fact, one of the things needs to be mentioned is that the engineering students themselves volunteered to pay more. The dean could say exactly how much, but I think it's in the order of $100 a term more for every student, so they could take that extra money and contribute it into a fund to help pay for equipment things, because the center wasn't paying enough. And so they, on their own hook, volunteered to pay more.
So as you see there,
That was my misunderstanding.
engineering is earning, or in 15-16, 1 year back, earned $14.1 million in tuition, but got only $9.3 million in base budget. We think that needs to be rebalanced slowly. Just had a question too from a colleague here. What about Congress? Congress is going ahead. We carefully put one-time money aside in the last 3 budget cycles for Congress. We intend to fill the residences. We intend to make large profits from food services from the 7,000 people who will be visiting campus in late May or early June 2018. It is going to cost us something, but we believe in the end that this will be very much a net plus for the university, and that it will bring thousands of people to the University of Regina who otherwise would never have come here, and which we think will have impact down the road in terms of faculty recruitment, graduate student recruitment, and general student recruitment, just when people see this campus in this city in late May and early June. As you know, one of the challenges of being in Regina is that people who haven't been here think it's not a very good place to be. If we can get them onto campus during that Congress for a big kind of academic festival, the biggest in the country, we believe we'll go a long way toward changing that image nationally of the university. So again, we're budgeting very carefully and very conservatively, and we think it's going to be a success and a net gain to this campus.
Mike's over here.
And by the way, since a scientist just left, everybody knows the Canada-wide Science Fair is on campus this month. We'll have close to 1,000 high school students from across the country and about 350 judges, judging in both English and French. Again, we're putting very little bit of money into that in an attempt to bring those students to our campus and say, give us a look. And when you're ready for university, maybe you'll come to the University of Regina because you're familiar with this campus and you were well treated when you were here. More attractive to you than, say, downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver. So that's one of the reasons that we're doing that Canada-wide Science Fair with about 1,000 people in total on campus this month. So I think that's about it, isn't it?
Last call for the 5th time.
Thank you again very much for coming, and this will be up, the video will be up, and the slides will be up within a couple of days.